A new blockbuster book, The Wolves of K Street, details power and power brokers in Washington, D.C. Today, we speak with one of the authors, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter from the Wall Street Journal, Brody Mullins. Together with his brother and fellow journalist, Luke, Brody spent months investigating the most prominent players from the past who are still impacting the present. In November, America will elect a president. The day after, real work begins behind the scenes. From Ballard Studios in Washington, D.C., it's 13th and Park.
We give you information, not a panic attack.
I mean, look what's going on. I mean, my God.
This was it. The kids were gonna die.
That time is gone forever.
This is the biggest story in America.
We weren't prepared for this.
Don't you want to speak truth to power?
Toughest thing I ever had to do.
Well, Brody, it's great to have you on the show. I got to say that your book, it's amazing. I was like mesmerized by it. I don't read a lot of books. I don't have a lot of time to read, especially a 600-page book. I couldn't put it down. You get that reaction?
Well, thank you. We do actually. It's about twice as long as we want it to be. I didn't want to write a 600-page book, but it does read very light. And people, we get calls from people who say, I read it in one day, one sitting. What
were the most telling takeaways from the three? You're talking about Podesta, Boggs, and of course, the juggernaut Black Manafort, Stone, and Atwater.
One interesting thing to me that I found is that this era that we're living in where companies have a lot of power might just be an era, and it might be coming to an end, actually. We see more and more populist Republicans, including Donald Trump, who are now kind of bashing corporate America more than the past, that companies have a lot of influence now, but they're also suddenly vulnerable.
And this was the big change where corporate America finally had not only a voice, but they actually had additional torque in those that were making big decisions that affected them and the rest of the country.
Yeah, in about the 1970s, the company sort of woke up and realized that there are so many rules and regulations, the government had grown so big, and there were so many taxes and regulations and rules that they wanted to fight back. So starting in the 1970s, companies really invested in lobbying and campaign donations to push back on the size of the government. And from then until now, companies have gotten incredibly influential. And in the last couple of years, we've seen this turn now against companies. So we'll see what the future brings.
Well, corporate America is having more and more challenges than ever in terms of its torque. It used to be in fundraising and politics, you would say, well, how do we line up the big players? And you're thinking corporate America, if you're a Republican in particular. Now it looks like it's going the other way, where power is going to, quote unquote, the people. Small donations from all over the country, especially digitally driven, are becoming bigger factors in political fates and in political power than ever before.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. For 40 years or so, corporate America and their PACs were the biggest source of campaign cash for Republicans and for Democrats. And now a couple of things are happening at the same time. One is some Republicans and Democrats are not taking corporate PAC money. As the amount of money they're getting from corporate PACs goes down, they're turning to those smaller donors. And when members of Congress are raising money from smaller donors and not raising money from corporate PACs, they're less beholden to what companies want them to do. And a lot of them, including a guy named Josh Hawley, are moving more and more away from corporate America, I think, because of that.
Well, let's talk about the bill that you've been writing about, you've been pushing recently, that involves Josh Hawley. And it's bipartisan, right? Which started with your kind of blowing the lid off something that people didn't appreciate, which is all those in government that had conflicts of interest because of stock ownership.
Yeah. So about 10 years ago, myself and some other reporters at the Wall Street Journal wrote a series of stories about members of Congress and their stock ownership. And a few years ago, we realized, it's really easy to find out what a member of Congress owns. Their publicly financial disclosure forms can be obtained, in a few clicks on the internet. But no one ever looked at federal agencies and sort of regular bureaucrats, people who run the machinery of the government, people who run the bureaucracy.
Right.
And these sort of nameless, faceless people have, incredible influence over day-to-day policy. And no one had looked at their finances. So we spent several months, myself and a team of reporters, pulling together thousands and thousands of these financial disclosure forms. And honestly, when we looked through them, we thought, surely these federal officials are not going to own stock in the things they regulate. And it turned out that we were wrong, sadly, that, 1 out of 5 top-level government officials own stock in a company that their agency regulated.
Did you ever talk to these individuals and say, hey, don't you think that's a bit of a conflict? You own oil and gas stock, and yet you're at the EPA making decisions that bear on that?
Yeah, so as reporters, we always talk to the people who we're going to write about, and we called every single person whose name appeared in the story, and they gave us a whole bunch of amazing explanations. One of whom was a guy at the Defense Department who was in the acquisitions division of the Defense Department at the Pentagon, whose job it is to get these huge government contracts with Boeing and Lockheed and whatnot. He was buying and selling Lockheed stock, and we said to him, "Why buying Lockheed stock?" And he said, "Well, I see that the Pentagon keeps giving him money. It seemed like a good investment."
Wow.
And it was a good investment, but he shouldn't have been the one making it.
It's funny because when you think about bureaucrats, the adjective usually is faceless, right? And maybe even nameless. You don't think about bureaucrats and their role in government and in government policy. Obviously, it's gigantic, but it's always seemingly behind the curtain.
Yeah, so one of the reasons I thought of this story idea actually is that I grew up in Washington, D.C. My dad worked at the Federal Communications Commission. He was a nameless, faceless bureaucrat. He was helping to regulate the cable and broadcast industry, giving them licenses or not giving them licenses. And I could tell that in this tiny world, tiny sector of the economy, he had a lot of influence. He told me that therefore he was not allowed to own cable and broadcast stock, and that makes sense.
Okay, so let's get into the meat of this interview. The book, obviously. There was some intended parallel to something that America remembers fondly from Hollywood. So I'm going to play you a clip.
This is my home. They're going to need a fucking wrecking ball to take me out of here. They're going to need to send in the National Guard or fucking SWAT team because I ain't going nowhere.
Clearly, there was some intentional parallel between the name of this book and that work of art.
Yeah, this is going to lead us to a debate about if our book gets made into a movie. Is Leonardo DiCaprio going to play me or Luke? Figure that out. But more importantly, watching that clip is kind of jarring. That is like Paul Manafort. I mean, Paul Manafort is going to be back. If Trump wins, he's going to be the most powerful lobbyist in Washington. You can almost repeat those quotes, and put them in Paul Manafort's voice. I mean, he's still going to be running in D.C. and sort of running Washington if Trump wins, which is sort of a remarkable turnaround.
Well, let's talk about Paul Manafort of Black Manafort Stone firm tradition. Was that one of the most compelling parts of your book, studying them?
Yeah, there are so many interesting anecdotes and stories we found, but it's definitely one of the best. I mean, what's amazing is how history repeats itself. So Paul Manafort and Roger Stone and Charlie Black were young 29, 30, 31-year-old aides on the Reagan campaign. It's hard to remember back to 1980, but in 1980, Jimmy Carter was president, so you're running against an incumbent. Secondly, George Bush was the establishment. He was the Republican Party's candidate. He was the insider. Reagan, like Trump, ran as an outsider, defeated basically the Republican Party and then the Democratic Party. And what's interesting to bring it to Manafort is that those guys worked on his campaign. And when Reagan won, there were no Republican influencers or lobbyists in D.C. who knew Reagan. All the Republicans who had been in town sort of were swept out with Nixon. And there weren't that many Republicans in D.C. in the first place because Democrats had controlled Congress for so long. So Paul Manafort said, well, we know Reagan. We can become a lobbyist. So they started their own lobbying firm and made millions of dollars representing the biggest players in industry at the time, TWA, Carl Icahn. Even Rupert Murdoch was an early client.
But their style, right, was all in on all fronts. So it wasn't just who they knew, access, you might say, but also putting together strategies and campaigns to try to move the public and by extension, move people here in Washington to a certain point of view on a policy using the kind of campaign tactics that were very popular and still are popular in campaign candidate politics.
Yes. So obviously you read the book. So, one of the things that we write about is sort of how lobbying has changed in Washington. And, lobbying used to be an access game and it's less so now. And Paul Manafort was sort of one of the early lobbyists who moved lobbying from access, which he had in the Reagan world and with a bunch of U.S. senators who he helped elect, to more of an outside campaign game. I mean, they were campaign guys. They knew that in a regular political campaign, the way you win is you get 51% of the people to vote for your guy, for your candidate. But then they realized, lobbying is the same thing. To get your issue to win, to get a corporate priority to win, or a corporate bill passed, you need to get 51% of the people to support that policy.
Right.
So they started using the same tactics, exactly as you just said, but instead of electing a candidate, you're driving an issue for a company.
And just to be fair, and coming from the book also, it wasn't a Republican-Democrat thing. It was on all sides. So talk about Tony Podesta.
Yeah. So, one of the things we write about in our book is that, lobbying is not a partisan issue. It's Republicans and Democrats, are involved. And in fact, companies in general don't really care if there's a Republican or Democrat, running Washington. They just want to be friends with that person.
Right.
So, one of the remarkable stats we found in our book is that when Republicans are in charge of D.C., not a surprise, corporate PACs give about 60% of their money to Republicans, but they also give 40% to Democrats. And then when Democrats are in charge, they give 60% of their money to Democrats. So companies just want to be in with whoever's in power, whether that's a Republican or a Democrat.
What should we take away from all this? What is the message that you and your brother were trying to impart about the process that swirls every day here in D.C.?
Yeah, in a 600-page book, there's obviously several messages. One of them is how companies have gained power in D.C. Second is how companies are all of a sudden, losing a little influence in Washington. But another main one is how little disclosure there is of how lobbying actually works today. So a lot of lobbying is focused on members of Congress, lobbyists, registered lobbyists who talk to members of Congress or talk to administration officials. Those people's activities are registered, they're disclosed. You have to fill out a form every quarter that says, here's my clients, here's what I'm working on. And the public or the press or constituents can go see that. A lot of lobbying now takes place outside of Washington, as Paul Manafort started to do,
right,
to get constituents to support issues. That type of lobbying is not disclosed at all, which means the public has very little view into how lobbying and the influence game really works today.
Well, you still have FARA regulations dealing with any foreign interests, right? So we'll talk about Paul Manafort did a lot of work abroad.
Yeah. So one of our main characters is a guy named Evan Morris, who is a big lobbyist for Genentech, the biotech company. We got a hold of their internal numbers, and his lobbying budget was $50 million a year. But on the disclosed part is only $5 million. And that gives you an insight, I think, to how lobbying really works. $5 million of the $50 million he spent, 1/10, is disclosed. The rest of it is in the shadows. And in the case of this guy, Evan Morris, he sort of realized that no one knew how he was spending that money. Reporters didn't know, the public didn't know, and his company didn't know. So he started stealing that money.
I think he committed suicide.
That's correct, yeah. After 10 years of stealing tens of millions of dollars, embezzling with another consultant, he got caught and ended up committing suicide, sadly.
Going through this book and researching the book, what was the most surprising or shocking thing you discovered?
I think one of the most shocking things is how prevalent lobbying is outside of Washington. We found this tactic called intercepts, is where industries or trade associations or companies will hire people to sort of bump into a member of Congress at the grocery store or, after church or something like that, where a member of Congress thinks they're talking to their constituents, but in fact, they're talking to a paid advocate.
Years ago, there was the focus on, okay, they're the Washington lobbyists, and then they're the lobbyists in Sacramento, and they're the lobbyists in Tallahassee. Now, more and more issues seem to be going across those kind of geographic borders where clients have interests that truly are both state and federal.
Yeah, I think that's the case. And in fact, I think a lot of the lobbying I see is, again, not with registered lobbyists, but with public affairs campaigns where you're doing internet ads or you're doing actual ads on TV or cable, where you're trying to influence constituents overall. Because, the idea is that a member of Congress exists to get reelected. They need to get reelected, and therefore they need to support their constituents. So lobbyists know if you go out and get constituents to support some company issue or some environmental group issue, for that matter, the lawmaker will follow.
Let's say, for argument's sake, that Donald Trump were to win the election this fall in 24. I remember 2016. I remember after the election, I was in Washington the next week, walking around. It felt like a ghost town, especially on K Street.
Yeah.
You had the same experience?
Absolutely. I distinctly remember actually walking down K Street also getting a sandwich that day. And, people looked like a bomb had just gone off. We were told that Donald Trump had no chance.
Right.
Washington is part of the establishment, and the Clintons are part of the establishment. So even though the Clintons are Democrats, companies were comfortable with her. I mean, she got a lot more money from corporate America than Donald Trump did. And, Trump's message was, I'm going to go to Washington and turn it upside down. So if you're in Washington that day, you're not feeling too good about your job and your career.
Well, I just remember people were saying, well, who knows Donald Trump? And the response usually was a blank stare. But this time, if Donald Trump were to win again, he's better known, and there are more people that are closer to him now than certainly even knew him back in 16.
Yeah, that's certainly true. If he knew a handful of people in Washington last time, now he knows several hundred from his time before. Last time, Washington was caught flat-footed, and no one had done the investment to get to know Trump or his people, or very few people had made that investment. Now people know, he can win because he won before. Mm-hmm. So any smart lobbyist or any smart firm, is hiring up people now who are close to Trump, or at least trying to create those relationships with people who could be in his cabinet, a J.D. Vance again, or other senators or other Republicans around the country who could be part of his cabinet or his government. You want to get to know those people now because you know that he could win.
Do you think there would be a difference in this town based on Donald Trump winning in 24 versus whoever the Democrats are going to advance?
In a normal case, there's a big difference between the Republican and Democratic agendas. I think this case, they're actually not that different, as crazy as that sounds. And that's because a lot of Republicans and Democrats are sort of becoming more anti-corporate. I mean, the big business agenda in my lifetime has been lower taxes, less regulation, free trade, and open immigration. And the parties, especially the Republican Party, have turned against immigration. Trump is against immigration, obviously. Free trade is out the door, has been gone for 10 years. Regulation is a big difference between Republicans and Democrats, and taxes are a big difference. But we are hearing more and more about some Republicans, again, back to Josh Hawley, who the other day was talking about how maybe some of these corporate tax cuts are not needed. Another example is antitrust. I mean, more and more Republicans and Democrats are saying these companies have gotten too big and need to be regulated. And there are a lot of Republicans out there who agree with Lena Khan at the Federal Trade Commission that these companies should be reined in, especially tech. So in that way, it almost doesn't matter who wins.
Okay, so your brother, he's, of course, been a contributing writer to Politico, Washingtonian Magazine, Mother Jones, all sorts of publications. How was it like working with your brother on this book? And did you both focus on different things?
It took us a couple of years to figure out the best way to work together. And by the end, the way it worked out is that he's a much better writer. So it ended up that I sort of would give him like really messy, deeply reported chapters that he would sort of clean up and make them into final chapters. And so most of the book and sort of the arc and how the stories about people come and go and about when we fade people in, when we fade them out, that was sort of all left up to Luke.
Are you working on anything next? What is your next project?
Yeah, so we're thinking about this area now. I mean, most of our book is about the rise of corporate power. And as I mentioned, corporations seem increasingly under attack now by the right and the left. At the same time, the fact that there's so many changes in the Republican Party, that the Republican Party has gone from, being in lockstep with the Chamber of Commerce and with corporate America and is now not. I feel like that could be a good book. And maybe both those books are combined into one.
Do you think that this is something that kind of mirrors what's going on out there right now, that so many things are kind of up in the air in terms of what has been normal practice, that anything is possible moving forward?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, the establishment in Washington was a bipartisan group of people who sort of had gotten what they wanted from the 1980s to now, and the establishment has always won. And now it seems like there's more and more attacks on the establishment because the rest of America, which is 99% of the country, hasn't liked the direction that we're going in. And I think they're trying to do everything they can to turn Washington upside down and to change what we're doing right now.
So I need to know, when are you going to start casting for the movie on this book? I want to put my name in right now together with a lot of my friends. We'd love to play one of the many roles that were represented and reflected in the book.
We're working on that right now. I mean, that's one of the next steps. We're trying to figure out possibly another book, and we're still doing promotions for this book. And then we need to figure out how Hollywood works. As writers who write stories every day, it's one thing to try to learn how to write a book. Just lots more words, lots more sentences, lots more paragraphs, and eventually it's a book. But, TV, film, movies is all a whole new world that we need to learn about.
Well, I really appreciate you being on the show today. Thank you very much for taking all the effort, you and your brother, to write something I think that's important for the American public to know, which is kind of one way that Washington works. And I think the more we know, the better.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. This is great.
Great to have you.
Thank you.